You're listening to the Religion Unplugged podcast. I'm Matthew Peterson, editor of the show. When you picture an American church building, what do you think of? Is it a gothic palatial cathedral that dwarfs its neighboring buildings and carries with it an air of ancient mystery? Is it a small white chapel with a sharp steeple and a quiet humility about its presence? Or does an American church conjure up a visual that isn't all that glorious and isn't all that quaint? Something like a strip mall or a sprawling campus of boxy structures reminiscent of a convention center. While many Americans might picture the latter, equating all American Christianity with the sort of no bells and whistles aesthetic approach of evangelicalism, American Christianity is no stranger to beautiful architecture. In nearly every American city, beautiful, complex church buildings can be found. Spires, stained glass, clock towers, and vaulted ceilings are not only present in American Protestant churches, they're downright common. In fact, some of the most historically American church traditions, such as the PCUSA and the Episcopal Church, are in possession of many of these houses of worship. But for many conservative Protestants, the beauty of the church building stands in sharp contrast to the theological departure many of the mainline traditions have from orthodoxy. With many mainline traditions affirming LGBTQ lifestyles and, more importantly, calling into question core Christian doctrines such as the bodily resurrection of Christ or the authority of Scripture, it has been generally accepted that theologically conservative believers ought to steer clear of the main line and join more orthodox congregations, even if they meet in an old bank or an elementary school. But that position may be changing. In 2023, Christian Gen Z YouTuber Richard Ackerman, known online as Redeemed Zoomer, began Operation Reconquista. Operation Reconquista, which now appears to have changed its name to Operation Reformation, is a movement of American Christians who believe that restoring orthodoxy in mainline churches is possible and deeply important. And they don't discriminate by denomination. Operation Reformation seeks to reform the Episcopal Church, the United Methodist Church, the Presbyterian Church USA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, and many others. Their strategy is to have Christians join the few but findable mainline congregations who hold to more traditional Christian views, thus strengthening the conservative minority as the progressive majority, in their view, inevitably dies out. And though it certainly is a motivation, the movement isn't merely about reclaiming the physical church buildings. It's about reclaiming the cultural influence that many of these denominations hold in the American public. These churches often already have robust networks of service and outreach organizations. They're located conveniently in the center of American towns, and they're generally well connected to many facets of American life, from local government to community events. To better understand why conservative Christians are beginning to consider joining a mainline church and why their presence just might be effective, culture critic Joseph Holmes interviewed Joe Coletti, who's known online as Young Anglican. Joe was previously a member of the Anglican Church in North America, but has recently left the ACNA to join the Episcopal Church. Though he has been vocally cautious and even resistant of Operation Reconquista since its beginning, he has now embraced the main line, but with a key difference from the rest of the movement. Joe is interested only in the reclaiming of the church which sits at the very center of historical American social influence, the Episcopal Church. Here's Joe and Joseph.
Well, thank you so much, Matthew, you smart, talented, and handsome man. I'm Joseph Holmes, film and culture critic for Religion Unplugged, and today I am proud to welcome another Joseph to the show. Joe Coletti is a layman in the Episcopal Church who runs a number of social media accounts, namely a YouTube channel under the name Young Anglican. Joe is converted to Christianity from conservative rabbinic Judaism and was baptized as an adult in the ACNA, that's the Anglican Church of North America. He received a bachelor's degree in history from Franklin and Marshall College and is currently a student at Penn State University. Joe, welcome.
Thank you. So I was a law student at Penn State, but I think that's my bio from Northam. That was
yes, it absolutely is.
Yes, that was like a year or two ago. But yeah, now I'm a practicing lawyer in Pennsylvania.
Amazing. Cool. Yeah. All right. So you heard it here first, folks. Or you heard these. That's why I always like my guests to be here to correct me.
For sure.
Yeah, fantastic. And again, I've been a fan of yours for a while. I've listened to your stuff. Very excited to have you on the show. And of course, one of the reasons, just beyond the fact, of course, that it's another Joe, we Joes have to stick together. um, So again, I was really happy that my boss signed off on me interviewing you for a couple of reasons. One is it's relevant to my personal journey because I grew up Episcopalian. One thing I always joke with people is that I grew up Episcopalian and also by coincidence Christian. With you're the first Episcopalian who's laughed at that joke. But the bigger reason is that you and your story dovetails with a lot of things that separates your generation of visible American Christian Zoomers from the experiences of a lot of American Christians from previous generations, like boomers, Gen X, and millennials like me. So this is really a great chance for people not familiar with how Christianity in America is changing to have a window into a lot of these conversations. Now, to oversimplify, and correct me if I'm getting any of this wrong from your experience, we're more used to, and I say we as like millennials and above, are more used to each generation kind of being less religious and more liberal than the one before it. When people are Christian, we're used to them choosing more less traditional, more modern, non-denominational churches like Hillsong. We're also more used to women being more religious than men. We're more used to Christian apologetics focusing on defending like mere Christianity against secularism, and for Christian apologetics to be more focused on college campuses. But you're kind of more part of like a new generation that's where there hasn't been statistically like a revival per se, but the number of religious Americans have stopped dropping. And because the demographics of people who've left the church, the people who are left in the church, like you, are very different. You're much more conservative and speak to a much more predominantly male audience. You're much more committed to historic Christian denominations like Anglicanism and reject non-denominationalism. You're much more committed to defending your particular historic denominations. And the center of gravity in that world is like online apologetics, like people like Gavin Ortland or Pal Redeemed Zoomer and Trent Horn and yourself. Would you say that that's kind of like a fair summary of some of those kind of generational kind of shifts and differences?
100%, I would say that that is. And I even have some thoughts on maybe why I think that that is taking place. Part of it, I think, is, prior to, say, like World War II, people did have strong denominational identities. There were, even in like the public newspapers, you can find people debating Protestantism versus Catholicism or whatever, right? But that was kind of, I think after World War II, especially coming into like maybe the Cold War, there was this sense of like Christians shouldn't really be having those disputes in the face of these existential anti-Christian threats, say fascism, communism, all these kinds of things. And there was also that mixed with, you could say, the like growing Protestant liberalism, growing ecumenism, and say the Roman Church with Vatican II, yada, yada, yada. And so that kind of became passé. C.S. Lewis, who I greatly admire, is a great example of somebody who tended to make this kinds of emphases that partisanship was kind of passé. And just to an extent, I totally agree with him that sometimes, there's a Screw Tape letter where he talks about how Screw Tape, you can use these like strong partisan identities within the church to distract Christians. And I think that's totally true. However, I also think when that was happening in the United States, there were strong cultural identities. There were strong still, like the sense of Americanness was strong. And people, especially say like the 50s, before like, I don't know, Vietnam and Watergate and all these kinds of things, right? Still this, strong, positive feeling about being American that would substitute that identity element. To the extent that our generation has kind of come into the world left over from that, I do think there's a huge purely just identity crisis. I think that there are solutions the secular culture provides to, feed into your identity. I think there's, people will talk about like the alphabet soup, all these other kinds of identities that are being very popular with people my age. One of those alternatives, though, I think that people are kind of leaning into in my generation, if they're going to be Christian, is, hey, if I'm going to do this, it's going to be something I take the whole way. You know what I mean? Like, I'm going to really, and they're going to use it in a sense as an identity as well as a, kind of abstract theological position. For there are pluses to that, there are minuses to that. There's all kinds of things there, but I definitely think that's what's going on with my generation.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I think, what you're hitting on is the fact that we noted for a long time, and some of this goes back to John Locke, who was like, look, let's stop killing each other, please.
Yeah.
It's like, let's stop killing each other in the name of Jesus. Let's stop doing that. I have no interest in that. But in an American context and, let's say Anglo context, because you have C.S. Lewis, who you mentioned, who was one of those big proponents of mere Christianity. In fact, he wrote a whole book called Mere Christianity.
Yes.
Is that you make an excellent point. We have these existential threats that are specifically anti-Christian and anti-Christian values writ large. So we're like, guys, while let's leave aside some of these differences while we're attacking this existential threat. But you make an excellent point, which is that we didn't stop needing kind of more thorough identities. Mm-hmm. And so we merely substituted other ones like being an American or being our racial identity or other identities which have in our generation, again, millennial Zoomer, we've gotten to the place where we realize those are even more fragile and less defendable than others. And so you're right. There's the secular version of like, well, let me, create my sexuality as my identity or some, ethnic identity, very specific ethnic identity. And in a sense, the conservative or religious version of that is, well, let me go to the historic denominational identity. But it's still kind of part of that postmodern, let me choose my identity thing,
Absolutely.
Which is never been what historically you've done, even in those traditions that we're going back to. So
yeah, for the most part, if someone would say, I'm an Episcopalian, if someone was an Episcopalian and even if they were vehemently defending it, there was a 90% chances because they were born that.
Right, exactly.
Exactly.
Yes. So I want to take that. That's really cool context, but I want to zoom in on you in particular. So first, because again, I want to get to your big announcement that's really important to the super nerdy people who are involved in these online world of Christian YouTuber apologetics and Zoomer return to historic Christianity stuff. But I want to talk about your individual journey in particular because so let me I have a very specific I want to very specifically talk. Notes. I want to talk about your story. So you started out being Jewish and then became a Christian. And so I want to say, why, first of all, did you convert to Christianity? But then more specifically, why did you choose Anglicanism over non-denominational Catholicism or even Presbyterianism? And what got you started using YouTube as a platform for all that?
Yeah. So, and I could go through the in-depth version of my conversion story, and I have in other places. My attempt at an abridged version, I think, would be there was, I was raised in conservative Judaism. There's basically three branches of Judaism in the United States. There's Reformed, which we might equate to like liberal Protestantism, and then there's Orthodox, which we might consider, the exact same way it was practiced in 1700s shtetl Judaism or my ancestors, right? And then there's conservative Judaism right in the middle. That's what I was raised in. And, it was like you keep kosher in your house, but not in a way that would inconvenience other people, if you're out and all those kinds of things, So that was effectively how I was raised. It wasn't always as consistent. My grandfather, who was a strong influence on me, he actually was Orthodox, and he was more strong about it. All that to say, by the time I had my bar mitzvah, I didn't believe anymore. I did as a kid. I was very active as a younger kid, but by my bar mitzvah, I didn't believe anymore. Had qualms about it. Still went through with my bar mitzvah. Was an atheist. Substituted, I think very much like many people of my age, substituted my religious identity with political identity. Got very involved in left-wing politics in high school. But then was miserable. My mom noticed that it made me absolutely miserable. She didn't have a dog in the fight, really, about the political stuff, but she was like, you should probably go to therapy. My therapist started talking to me about the way that I looked at the world, and everything was everybody else's fault, and systems and all these other kinds of things. And just out of a concern for like my mental health, he started saying like, how can you start to take agency in your life? And actually do things. And I think that started to be intoxicating. At first I resisted the idea, but then it was like, okay, what are you afraid of? Do that thing. At that time in my life, I was 16, 17. I was struggling to like get a driver's license and take care of that. So he was like putting these concrete steps in front of me and being like, do it, and I did it. And I started to drive and learn all those kind of things and started to feel good about having this agency. Started finding like Nietzsche and some of those more kind of teenage characters. Left-wing politics, started to be kind of very agency focused. Got into, in the very early stages when he was just doing philosophy lectures, Jordan Peterson.
I was going to say.
Yeah. Yeah.
This sounds very Jordan Peterson coded.
Oh, absolutely it was. And it was like, I found that
I also went through that Jordan Peterson.
Yeah,
yes.
Absolutely. Got really into that. And he started to be the first one to really say like, hey, there is some cultural value in the biblical stories that can teach you something. Had some interesting mystical experiences with some of my friends, although we dismissed those at the time.
As you do.
Yes, as just kind of weird, maybe psychosocial experiences. Started to try to take... Actually, at this point, I went to a Catholic church and a Greek Orthodox church because that was kind of what was near me. I went to a mosque, just exploring religion in general. Decided, you know what, I should probably start to take Judaism seriously. That's kind of where I'm from first. Started to read the Bible. Got into the portions of the Old Testament that I was reading it cover to cover, listening to an audiobook really. Got to Isaiah and started hearing like Isaiah 7, Isaiah 52, 53, and started to... I knew the story of Jesus. I knew what Christians claimed about Jesus, and I was kind of like, that's a little on the nose, I think.
It's very Christian coded, yes.
Yes. And, I think also this was important to me at this point because even though I was starting to take religion more seriously, I don't think I necessarily believed the miracle claims. I don't think I believed in a literal God and all these kinds of things. But the idea that there was like a prophecy that was given to Jews 500 years before it came true, and then it did come true, that shook me up a little bit more. So the idea that taking religion literally, or you could say, or like that there's an actual omnipotent, omnipresent God in Christianity were very intertwined for me at that point already. Long, winding stories, reading a bunch of books. Again, for me, this was always very intellectual. This is when I found C.S. Lewis and was attracted even to just his concept of mere Christianity. That was the first book I read. I mean, as a kid, I had read the Narnia books. Sure. I had no idea they were a metaphor for Christianity or anything. I just liked fantasy stories as a kid.
Yeah.
But Mere Christianity was the first C.S. Lewis like apologetical work that I read, and I definitely appreciated his argument from, say, morality, and that made a lot more sense to me. Ended up in Bath, England, weirdly enough. Went to Bath Abbey. Somebody handed long story short. Somebody handed me an Alpha Course pamphlet in Bath Abbey and picked me up.
Alpha. Yes.
Yeah, presumably not knowing that I was in the middle of this deep religious struggle. Read the Alpha Course pamphlet, and if I had to kind of give my like evangelical conversion moment, I would say I was actually reading that Alpha Course pamphlet in my room during the summer abroad program in college, where I was like, yeah, I think I believe this. And I asked for forgiveness for my sins to God, and I was really making a real prayer I thought was going to be heard by God. Not just like to...
Not by the concept of God.
Yes, exactly.
But by God.
Yes, yeah. When I got back to my college, it was Franklin and Marshall. I was in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. A very interesting part of Pennsylvania, definitely a very deeply religious part of Pennsylvania, in a region of Pennsylvania, like kind of southeast Pennsylvania, which tends to not be as religious. But Lancaster's got this great history of, say, evangelicalism there. Anyway, I started attending a non-denom church with the woman who's now my wife. Okay, at this time we weren't dating or anything, we just knew each other, okay? For the context of how this goes, she had grown up Episcopalian. And when we met, I had started looking into Christian denominations. At first, I thought, my mom's family is Jewish, but actually my dad's family is Italian.
Explain his last name.
Yes, exactly. So I thought I'd become Catholic. Like before I had been in England and had this actual conversion, I thought if I became Christian, I'd probably become, Roman Catholic. Now my dad is probably one of the most vehement atheists in the world, so it wouldn't have been necessarily to get closer to my dad, but it was just kind of out of a sense of I'm Italian. That makes sense. I'd also really been into Peter Kreeft and Tolkien and those guys. So,
well, if you're going like radical traditional, like that's the natural, yeah.
That was 100% part of it. I think there's lots of people my age who that is similar, where, at this point you've gotten so far, I couldn't have conversations with, say, some of my more liberal friends about this, frankly, that I had tons of, because they would have completely rejected. So it's like at this point, I'm not making a halfway house of becoming Christian.
Right.
You know what I mean? I'm going to, even if it offends everybody I know, you know what I mean? I'm just going to do it. And wherever that takes me. But when I said to, again, a woman who's now my wife, I was like, hey, I think I want to go to a Catholic church when we get back. And she was like, have you actually read the Bible? Like, do you know what Catholicism says about the Bible? And I knew in the back of my mind, the Peter Kreeft stuff that I had read, the magisterium never contradicts the Bible. It just it helps interpret and all this, whatever. Even though, again, I had never actually read the Bible. I'd never actually read, to be fair, any serious Catholic doctrine. But then I was like, okay, I guess I probably should read the Bible. Got to some of the passages that now I would probably say aren't actually strong defeaters of Roman Catholicism, but to me, reading them, call no man father, stuff like that. Ended up in a non-denom evangelical church with her. But although I would say, a lot of people I know who end up Anglican, the big hurdle for them is infant baptism. But for me, it was the reverse. From the beginning, I was maybe it was Jewish background, maybe it was just the people I was reading. That made perfect sense to me, right? You get Old Testament circumcision. Inclusion is automatic when you're born, basically, in the covenant community. I got that. But I knew the evangelical church I was attending didn't do that. And I went to the pastor, I remember, and said, hey, I love this church. I love the community here. But I got to be honest, I believe in infant baptism. And he's like, oh, me too. I was like, what? And he's like, yeah, the denomination that we're technically a part of. Again, I assumed we were non-denominational. Apparently, they were actually a denomination. And they had a deep history and history. Very interesting small denomination. But had its own history. But he said, I actually baptized my kids. But he said it wasn't a dividing issue. And from going to that church for a couple months, I had never seen a single infant baptism. I'd seen infant dedications and all that kind of stuff. Was a little troubled by the idea that, he had this a theological opinion, but kind of decided it was a, shrug your shoulders, move on kind of thing. Thought about Presbyterianism, Anglicanism, wasn't convinced to stay by his attitude, I guess, really is the long and short of it. What was ultimately really attracted to Anglican authors. I always loved C.S. Lewis. I started reading interdenominational stuff. I won't get too much into that, but John Jewell, who's an early Anglican guy. Got really into that. And we just admired the tradition. The first place that I really would say I had a conversion experience was in an Anglican church in England, Church of England church. So was attracted to it, went to my wife and said, hey, I think, but again, at this point, we probably were dating. And I said, hey, I think I would like to go to an Anglican church. And she's like, Joe, I grew up Episcopalian. All the reasons you're giving me for becoming Anglican, they don't believe that anymore. I grew up there and they don't believe any of that stuff. And I was like, what? Kind of upset. But I was able to find through the internet, Ready to Harvest videos or whatever, right? That the Anglican Church in North America existed and that they purported to believe a lot of that stuff. And I was attracted to that. Started going to an ACNA church kind of as an inquirer. At this point, I had never been baptized because in that evangelical church, I'd been there 6 months-ish. Still wasn't a priority, really, I guess. So started going to this church, had a very positive experience with the liturgical elements. I was used to liturgy growing up Jewish. I mean, me and my wife still laugh about this today. The first time I went to that non-denom church, I showed up in a suit and tie. And she was like, you're going to laugh when you see what everyone else is dressed like at this church. Because I was used to going to shul and it's everyone's in suit and tie and you have the tallis and everything. It's very formal. That was what I was used to. And actually kind of always liked that a little bit more. like the liturgical elements, although the ACNA church, it wasn't like everyone's dressed in suits and ties and that kind of liturgy, but they took it a little more seriously. They took the Eucharist seriously, which at that point I had been convinced that of the spiritual real presence in the Eucharist and the traditional Protestant view on that. And really enjoyed our community there, had a good pastor, got settled in, got baptized, and that was like my home for then being theologically interested. Started having conversations with my pastor, who is a great guy still to this day. Talk with him every once in a while. He was like, hey, you're really like intellectually into this. Lots of people in this college, I was at Penn State at the time, this college town that converted at this church to Christianity that he experienced. There was some intellectual aspects, but it wasn't as much as like I had been really getting into, the biblical exegesis of Isaiah 7 and whether or not it means virgin or just young lady or whatever. Or Isaiah 9, I can't remember now which one's the Emmanuel verse and which one is the he'll be born of a virgin verse. But anyway, he was like, have you thought about sharing some of this with folks? And talked a little bit about it. And I look back on it now on some of those really early videos and wish that I had waited a little bit longer, but like basically a month or two after I had converted got been baptized, not converted. I guess it would have been at that point like a year since I had converted. I was making YouTube videos about the problem of evil and whether or not, you can distinguish between the validity of animal life and human life without religion and, these kind of things that I was thinking about at the time, which I would say were majority like mere Christianity concepts. However, I named my channel Young Anglican because I was at an Anglican church, and then like I was getting like 14 views per video probably, right? But then when I did get comments, they weren't about the subject of the video. They would be about Anglicanism. They'd be like, isn't that the Henry VIII religion? Why do you believe that? And then I would make responses to that, and those got way more attention than anything I was doing about like the problem of evil or aliens and stuff like that early on about whether or not Christians should respect alien life. I thought those were interesting questions and kind of started to feed more into that. Of course, I didn't actually know the full depths of those interdenominational dynamics at that time and the distinctives, but started to try to answer those questions to the best of my ability. Like, hey, Anglicans don't think of Henry VIII as this guy who founded our religion. Like, as a historical figure, all these other kinds of things. Answering those questions, that got me a lot more traction. I met Redeemed Zoomer at this point, although we disagreed on, say, the Reconquista, if we can get into that in a second.
Oh, yes.
My channel definitely started to get more followers once he had me on his channel to talk about the differences between Anglicanism and Presbyterianism. And I think that showed that there were a lot of young people. The majority of my audience are below 31. A lot of young people who are trying to figure out the answers to these denominational questions. And I do think it has to do with that kind of search for identity, at least, that we talked about earlier.
Yeah. So there's a lot there. I wish we had 3 hours to unpack all of them. But I do want to move on to that element of the Reconquista, because again, a lot of the other elements, although interesting, are things that people have been discussed elsewhere. But this is one of those big distinctives of the new, YouTube Christian apologetics and particularly this movement in sort of Gen Z conservative Christianity, the idea of the Reconquista. Of course, Redeemed Zoomer kind of introduced and coined this idea of Reconquista because, again, historically, American churches, when there's theological disagreements, particularly when you had a drift towards progressive or liberal theology, like conservatives would split off and create their own denominations. And people then, of course, in good, American capitalist fashion, people would choose their church based on whether or not they agreed with the theology of the church. And of course, and to some degree that you're a part of that as well, where it's like, okay, I've got, Presbyterianism, I've got Catholicism, I've got non-denom. I actually agree more with the historic theology of the Anglican Church. However, the Reconquista movement argues that instead, not only should we not split from churches even if they drift, but we should instead abandon the churches that sort of split off and go back to the more historic denominations that with a kind of plan to kind of retake them, the Reconquista, repopulate them with, traditional faithful Christians. And of course, as those denominations die out, because they are dying out, then they will all be filled with people like you, Joe. And 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 of course it's interesting because it's already essentially kind of what's happening in the Catholic Church, as Ryan Burgess talked about, is that the only people who are becoming Catholic priests are like these trad people, and so the whole Catholic clergy is becoming trad and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. But as you alluded to, and this is one of the things I think you're an interesting voice in this, is that, on your channel, you were someone who openly disagreed with people like Redeemed Zoomer promoting the Reconquista movement, and instead defending being part of the ACNA that split from the Episcopal Church of America when the church elected a gay bishop and affirmed gay marriage, which, again, as someone who grew up in the Episcopal Church, that was definitely a big part of my life, which we don't have time to go into, but that I definitely remember that. Mm-hmm. But of course, you shocked this new corner of the Christian internet space by switching from ACNA to the Episcopal Church and wrote a whole big essay published in the North American Anglican defending your change. And I encourage everyone to read that piece by you and the responses to it. That's going to get much more depth than we can do right now. But can you give your viewers a summary of why the big switch? Why were you so, arguing against it before, and then became convinced that actually the Reconquista movement was correct?
I think Redeemed Zoomer would agree with my summary that when we would have those initial disagreements, his position was a fundamentally sociologically based position, like similar to what you were just saying about now. Oh, well, actually, if you look at the demographics over time, like it will change. And here's all the advantages to being in an institutionally, old church. Here's all the negatives about these splits that are practical. That's where it started for him. And then it evolved into a theological, strong position about schism and splits. Okay. For me, I think when we would have those initial disagreements, I could sense that. And I said this actually in our first conversation he and I had on the Reconquista. I said, if God actually wanted the Reconquista, whatever you want to call it, I think I would support it because anything is possible with God. I don't think God wants us to do that. That was what I thought at the time. So I said, no, I think here's what God wanted, there to be a split and the ACNA and all this other kind of stuff. For here's my theological reasons, XYZ, and I would go back and forth and we would talk. Although I will say, even on both sides, you get this kind of practical argument, right? So you get some ACNers who will say, okay, fine, this argument that, they read my article, fine, about why I think splits are bad, and I don't think that the split with the ACNA was theologically warranted, because I don't think that the theological issues at the core touched upon the fundamentals of Christian faith. That's basically my summary of my position. They'll say, fine, but your Reconquista won't happen. When they'll always use Reconquista and they'll equate the position to Redeemed Zoomers, and we have slightly different positions, because I wouldn't say, generally we should join mainline Christian denominations, period. My position is that the Episcopal Church of the United States is you could say, valid jurisdiction of Christ's universal Catholic Church in the United States. By Catholic, I of course mean universal, right? Right. Total church over the whole world. And I would only argue for the Episcopal Church, and we can talk about that in a second maybe, but for theological reasons. However, I do also think there are interesting sociological kind of things on the back end that we can talk about. What's happened? Have they been good? Have they been bad? It is worth mentioning, I think, at least, that for whatever sociological reason, institutions, period, not just churches, tend to split right. So they split conservative. The conservatives tend to say, hey, we no longer believe with the direction this is going. We're forming a new institution. And the liberals, or the people who are trying to progress the institution into a different position, they tend not to split over that. They tend to just push the whole denomination and then bleed slowly over time, and the institution will slowly die. This is not just true for churches. This is also true for lots of secular institutions as well. People can talk about the Boy Scouts, right? The Boy Scouts also had this slow progress, and then you can see that as soon as they made these changes in there, now they accept girls, you get this plummet in attendance, and people are bleeding and leaving the institution. And then there's rival, alternative, more conservative versions of the Boy Scouts that start popping up. Okay.
Yeah.
And you could say to some extent that's like a feature of maybe American consumer culture or something like that. Although I will say, even in Europe, you do get, okay, here's the established, more liberal denomination, and then you get the split of the conservatives that pop off and do their own thing. It happens in the Netherlands with the Dutch church, happened in Germany with the Lutheran church, fairly consistently. That just is sociologically how it always ends up shaking out, I guess. Which I think as conservatives, you have to start to say, like, is this the ideal? And I think what a lot of people might have thought before these splits occurred, and when they were contemplating whether or not to split, say in the 70s, which is the first time the Episcopal Church split over liberalism, they were thinking, you know what will happen? We will split off, and then we as an institution will rival the institution of the Episcopal Church. And then with the continuing Anglican churches, the original Anglican Church in North America in the 70s, that clearly didn't happen, and then they split with themselves like 5 times. Okay. Then there's this, I would say, even within the ACNA, there's this hope that eventually as an institution, they will rival the Episcopal Church. And that's why they try to have such this broad tent on issues that even divide the ACNA internally that I used to fight about with other ACNAers, like women's ordination. And they fight about that because the hope is, at the end of the day, they will be an institution like this. And I think for young people coming into this climate, no matter what you think of the Episcopal Church's future prospects, it's still the church at the center of town. In a lot of these towns, it's still the institution that when Donald Trump or whatever is going to get talked to by a bishop, it's going to be a bishop of the Episcopal Church and not an ACNA bishop. You know what I mean? Like, that's just not how this works. And I think some people in my generation, because especially young men who feel alienated by the kind of cultural liberal malaise, like Redeemed Zoomer, myself as well. I think I came out of that same thing and came into this realization of opposition to it. A lot of young men specifically, they don't really see that retreating strategy, you could say, sociologically coming to some massive amounts of fruit in the culture, which is a lot of the people who feel alienated that end up seeking their identity in Christianity, which I think is actually kind of a good instinct in general, but we'll talk about that in a second. They don't see that as solving that same problem. But some people, alternatively, my generation, there's just as many people who are going like, say, Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox, because they do see those institutions as the institutional solution to their cultural problem. And you'll see all of this, propaganda on Twitter or Instagram, like imagining the Eastern Orthodox version of America. And it's like, all these guys are thinking 100 years, we'll retake. And it's a very similar.
And then you'll be just like the, Eastern Europe that never had all the good things that the West brought us. But that's a whole other thing. Yes.
Exactly. And to some extent, I think all of these groups are doing a little bit of wish fulfillment, including, say, Reconquista, right? Where we think it's going to be in some position at some point. Although I do think it's slightly more authentic to say, here is this institution, that actually has deep roots in American society, that if it were going to become a force for good again, would actually have a, shot in the dark of actually doing that for, say, the political establishment or the culture abroad. People will talk about, say, Billy Graham, like some of his best friends were like Nixon and Eisenhower and presidents, because he was able to recognize, this is a sphere for for evangelism.
Yeah, so this is really interesting. And I want to get to kind of the theological aspects of this, because that's, one of the things that does separate you from someone like Redeemed Zoomer or some of the other Reconquista people. But I do think that you make an excellent point that, again, a lot of what each generation does is react to the perceived failures of the one before it. And one thing for people who are kind of like, why would you go back to the, liberal mainline if you're so conservative? Like, the answer, a lot of that to that on an emotional level, at least partly, is, well, you guys have been splitting as long as I can remember. And how has that worked out for you? You know, you might as well, the end result of that is non-denominationalism, where and if I'm rejecting that, which is another way of rejecting our culture's just kind of fragmentation in general, which is the reason you would be attracted to religion, conservative, whatever it is, then why wouldn't you reject the schismizing that's kind of the result of that? I think even if people might disagree with you, understanding it at that level, you can understand where it's coming from. But let me see if I can summarize because I read your essay, and you are definitely more theologically, literate than I am. The vast storehouses of your knowledge and ability to articulate. But I'm going to try to be the layman who can unpack it for our audience, and you can tell me all the places where I got it wrong. So essentially, God established his church in the world with no less authority, in fact, more so because he's God, than any earthly government. And historically, church fathers with near universal agreement believe that this meant that the threshold for abandoning a church, and especially setting up a new parallel church, was very high. Because doing so would be like, the South seceding during the American Civil War, except you're not rebelling against something man has established, you're rebelling against something God has established. And essentially, what you've determined from the church fathers is it's only acceptable to leave a church and especially set up a new one if the church demands in its official church documents and teachings that you either A, have to believe something that God forbids, or B, deny something that God affirms, like the Unitarian church that denies the Trinity. And that's the only point at which a church can be called not a true church, and therefore can be acceptable to start a new church because there's not already a church there. And that's essentially the argument, right?
Yep, I think that was a great summary, better than I've been able to summarize it, honestly.
Well, you were free to steal it.
Yes, yeah.
But now, so the counter arguments so there's a couple of counter arguments that I've seen that I want to get your thoughts on. Yeah. And then I've got a couple of my own kind of questions about it that I want to, if we have time, I want to get to. But let's start out. So the first thing that I hear people say is, okay, well, then why not just be Catholic? Because you still, in most of your interactions, talk about Catholics as if they're still also Christians. They're not Unitarians, the way you would say, well, that's not. So by your logic, and it's like, again, you have disagreements with people in the Episcopal Church that many people would consider more vast than some of the things that you would have disagreements in the Catholic Church. So why is it that you would say that the Anglican schism is valid, but not the ACNA schism from the Episcopal Church?
Yeah. So two things, and one of the distinctions that I try to make in the article itself, which you alluded to in your summary, was there's actually a difference between a negative separation and negation, where you say I'm no longer taking communion with that body of Christians, and there's which is what I would say happened in the English Reformation and lots of the Reformation, where there was like this church over here no longer taking communion with that church over there. But they're not starting a new parallel church where they're doing new church plants and building new diocesan structures, let's say. That didn't happen in the Church of England's Reformation, where it's the same thing that happened with East-West schism. So between the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholics, there was Church of Constantinople over here, and then there was Church of Rome over here, and they just stopped being in communion. And at least the Eastern Orthodox still didn't make a new bishop of Rome and do a parallel, what I would call a positive separation, because it posits or creates something new in the place of those old churches. Okay, so first of all, I would say the different separations of kind, because the Anglican Church in North America was a positive separation. It actually created a new thing in the place of the Episcopal Church. And that's what they said they were doing. They said, we're starting a new province in the Anglican Communion, and their hope was to be accepted by, originally actually, the Archbishop of Canterbury and all the instruments of communion. Now, they failed to get the acceptance of the Archbishop of Canterbury, but they did get a lot of support from, say, Nigeria, very popular, large churches in the global south. So I would say that, first of all, is the difference. The next one I would say is, I think some people will will equate the differences, but it's very, I don't even know if I would hold this view. In some places in my article, I just describe other theologians' views and say, hey, what if we applied this test to today? I don't think it would stand. But say John Davenant, who he says that the Roman Catholic Church still affirms all of the fundamentals of Christianity, then he actually does still believe that a positive separation would have been legitimate from the Church of Rome. And this is how he defends the Huguenots. If you know your Protestant history, the French Protestants he thinks are completely fine. Although, again, he still doesn't think the Church of England or even the Church of Scotland or the Church of the Netherlands had this positive separation. All that to say, he locates it in the fact that the papacy, the doctrine of the papacy is so egregious. Okay. Whatever you think about the differences between Protestantism and Roman Catholicism, say like indulgences, which I think touches upon the how we are saved question and is a very important salvation question. The idea that the question about, say, same-sex marriage, which is the inciting doctrinal disagreement between the Anglican Church in North America and the Episcopal Church, the idea that that's obviously the same as indulgences or the papacy isn't as obvious, I think, when you take a step back. At least for me. It used to be to me. Like when I was in the Anglican Church in North America, it was obvious these were probably comparable issues. But indulgences touch upon how we are saved. The question of whether or not God would ontologically accept two men trying to get married to each other, which I don't think he would, right? But that's a separate category, in my opinion, than how are we as Christians coming to be saved by Jesus Christ, right? So even if it's wrong, even if it's very wrong, even if it's something that the Bible consistently condemns, which I still completely believe, you have to ask whether or not it's the category of doctrines that requires a parallel institution in the place because, in my opinion, and I think you said this very well, if you're saying there needs to be a new church in, I don't know, Tuscaloosa, Alabama, it's because I think the standard, my essay tries to point out, it's because there are no churches in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. There is not a Church of God there. So you need to make one, right? So if that would be the question, I think, that you'd have to ask fundamentally is there a Church of God there? So even if you would say, I think this is another thing, I point this out in hopefully my upcoming response article to some of the responses to me in North American Anglican. Even if you thought that the Episcopal Church had lost her jurisdiction, the second thing you'd have to justify, I think, would have to be that there are no other churches, and that the formation of the ACNA is the only way we can have a church in the United States. I think that is consistently the only view that was created by people who did set up parallel jurisdictions in church history, let's say like the Huguenots. Because if you read their confession, they say that the Church of Rome is not a church anymore, right? So they have to do this. Yeah.
So if I'm understanding correctly, again, correct me if I'm wrong, is that there are two things that separate it. One is just the order of magnitude of the false doctrine, because how we are saved and how we define ourselves as a Christian is a different category entirely than how do we apply our beliefs about Christianity to living in the world in terms of sexuality or things like that. Again, both of those are important, but one is completely different from the other because one defines you as a Christian and the other defines how you're applying the ethics we learned from the Bible. And the second is, and you touch on this only more slightly, but I want to make sure that this is correct. One is more here, I am forcing you to affirm these doctrines that are false, whereas the other is I'm going to allow doctrines that may be false. Would you say that that's an accurate depiction of the differences?
100%. I mean, that's, I think, a big difference, say, another one between Rome, where they say you have to affirm transubstantiation, you have to affirm indulgence, you have to affirm all the other things. Whereas the complaint, I think most people would have about the Episcopal Church, and again, just to get into the history of the ACNA wasn't formed when the Episcopal Church started allowing same-sex marriage rights. They were formed once a gay bishop was ordained, and they thought that shouldn't be allowed, period. Therefore, we're out. And then after that is when the same-sex marriage rights came into approval in the General Convention, which, of course, at that point was easy because now all these conservative bishops are left.
Yeah.
Right? So, yeah.
Okay, so Excuse me. I want to touch on a couple more responses that I'm curious about if we have time. But at least
Yeah.
one that I've heard is, where kind of the authority of jurisdiction lies in the Anglican communion, because as it is often mentioned, it is a global Anglican communion. And it is true that the Archbishop of Canterbury recognized, the Episcopal Church, but a lot of other, Anglican bishops throughout the world and the global South did recognize the ACNA as the legitimate heirs of Anglicanism. And to some people who are not maybe, as versed in some of these things, and I'm not saying that they're wrong, but I'm just saying for the layman, it looks a little bit Eurocentric to be like, well, obviously, the white bishop in England who just decides that the Episcopal Church is the correct one, but all the African bishops in the global South who are, who say it's not legitimate, well, they're wrong. And so I guess what we say is, why do you think that the people who have affirmed the Episcopal Church as the legitimate heir are correct, and the ones that have not affirmed the AC, or who have affirmed the ACNA, are wrong?
Yeah. I think there's a lot of people like to do the shortcut arguments. So like there are Episcopalians who will say, oh, well, Canterbury has always been recognized as I would never make the argument from Canterbury. I also wouldn't, though, parallel in that on the other side, say, oh, just because some bishop in Africa recognizes that you're legitimate. I would also say lots of the African bishops, excluding some, I think Nigeria, Rwanda, and Uganda did say the Episcopal Church is no longer good. A lot of them have said, oh, well, both are fine, kind of a don't want to make any enemies kind of position. And I disagree with that position as well. The argument that I would make is, was the Episcopal Church the legitimate jurisdiction prior to the split? I mean, I think both sides would have to agree on that. Otherwise, where does the ACNA get her jurisdiction from, right? Was it the right before the split? And then was the split justified? My answer was no. So, and I think that's really the question that I would pose. It would less be related to, say, the politics or government of the Anglican Communion, because two things. One, the Anglican Communion as a whole recognizes, for instance, non-Anglican churches as legitimate jurisdictions in their countries. So like Sweden, Church of Sweden isn't an Anglican church, but it is recognized by the Anglican Communion as the church in Sweden of God. Like there's no parallel Anglican jurisdiction there, and we're in communion with the Church of Sweden, Church of Norway, Church of Denmark. Like they're just recognized as legitimate churches, even though they don't have anything to do with the instruments of Anglican communion. So it's entirely possible that the Anglican Communion wouldn't, like everybody would be wrong, and it would just be the Episcopal Church would be right. Okay, that's possible. I don't think that is the situation, because it's an argument from government and the abiding of laws, I would say, and whether or not, the canon law up to this point, let's say, has been followed by what jurisdiction or not. And it can be slightly less mechanical than that. But basically, was the Episcopal Church legit? Yes. Did it lose its legitness? No. Okay, it's still legit. That's basically, I guess, the argument I would make. And I don't think, say, like a Church of Nigeria, or actually the Church of the Southern Cone, which is now the Church of Chile in the Anglican Communion, no one would have said prior to the split that they had the jurisdiction to create these parallel provinces, which they did do prior to that. So they kind of just made it up as they were going, would be my argument, that they could do that. Yeah.
Okay. So I guess my final question, unless I think of another one when we have time, but is a separate argument that I've heard, but I think kind of resonates with the modern kind of American mindset and kind of the world we live in right now. And I think it's not always articulated, but it's a lot of where most people make their kind of decisions. The part of our American heritage is in, like I alluded to John Locke, who said, look, we have been killing each other over these things for a really long time. And the solution to this is that we give people choices of churches. And you can go to the church that most fits your theology. And you can kick people out of your churches who you think are heretics. And we're going to leave that to the churches. And so some of this kind of like we're criticizing right now of this schisming, this kind of, and this picking and choosing kind of your churches is a solution to a problem that we had before, to the time period that maybe you or I are kind of romanticizing, where it's like, yeah, let's go back to these traditional churches who were killing each other over these things because they didn't have an option. If you disagreed with this and you felt like your conscience was being forced, then you didn't have another option of a church to go to because you weren't allowed to schism. And so there is a worry, there is a potential problem. It's kind of like the whole Christian nationalist argument, where it's kind of like, okay, like, when are we going to start, killing Catholics and Protestants again? Is, maybe we're, it's a good thing that we can split off from each other. And then more specifically, most people, I think, would look and say, again, I think there's a lot of people who would say, yeah, I think we should stop schisming. I think schisming is a bad thing. Even I look back kind of on that schisming in the Episcopal Church, and I'm kind of like, man, maybe if you could go back, it's like better for all those people to stay within the Episcopal Church and fight to retake it, in the same way that Republicans and Democrats fight to retake the government every year instead of schisming off into a new country. Let's have that be the model, because we've seen how effective that often can be. But if you take the country analogy, when a new country has created and has existed for a long time, it's also a good thing maybe not to try to delegitimize the new country and try to reconquer it. Not to bring in global politics that immediately come to mind for everyone, where it's like, and instead allow people to choose the country that best fits their culture and their sensibility. So for today, maybe for today, say, choose China or Taiwan, or if you want to talk to churches, it's like, you know what? Yes, I don't think that we should have split from the Episcopal Church and the ACNA. But now that we have, the ACNA fits my theological convictions a lot more than the Episcopal Church does. And so maybe the split was wrong, but this is still a real church by any definition of church, with all the same creeds and doctrines. So why not choose to go to that church and go to that church instead? Why should you instead abandon that church and go to the Episcopal Church?
I would say, I think so. There's two arguments about, say, when is a nation as a political entity legitimate in separating? And like we touched on earlier, I think part of this I would allocate in, like, nations are human constructs. The difference would be, I would say, the Church of God is a divine institution, which has a even different standard than I would say like a national identity does. But fundamentally, I think also we would say, why do we get like national churches? Most societies, even in the pre-Constantine era, right? You had the Armenian church over here and the Ethiopian church over here, and then there was the church that was actually in the Roman Empire. Well, part of that was, okay, we know there's this thing called the church. We want this thing to have a relationship with the national zeitgeist, right? We don't want it to be a club we go to and forget about. Most people want it to have a relationship with their secular life as well. Now, is that to violate the distinction between church and state? No, I, as an American, believe in the separation between church and state. Right? I don't think we should have some kind of legal penalty for leaving the Episcopal Church, right? But I do think there is a cathedral in the United States called the National Cathedral, and it is owned by the Episcopal Church, and senators and congressmen and the president, they all go there all the time, whether or not they are Episcopalian, right? Because they just recognize, well, this is an institution in our society that I have to respect, in the same way that in, say, England, right, there are bishops in their House of Lords, right? Which I'm not advocating for that either, but I think if we really want to be in a society that doesn't have actually a militant relationship, where you pit the church against the society, which I think it feels like for a lot of people today, right? Where you have your very strong conservative evangelical church over here, and then there's a secular society, and they kind of are in tension and they're fighting and they don't have a positive relationship. the key is, I think, you can have, I think what the solution was for the previous generation was, we can have our church, but it won't be in tension with the culture because it won't contradict the culture. It'll just say everything the culture already believes. You know what I mean? That'll be the safe solution to that tension. And then over here you have this church that does contradict the culture, but it will participate in the culture because it doesn't want that same conflict. I think I think a lot of people from my generation that are disillusioned with the culture can recognize is that what you end up doing when you have this attitude of kind of the perfect bubble is you actually abandon the culture to itself and you let it have its own attitude and its own worldview. So to the extent that, okay, well, the Taiwanese, they want a nationalist government that's capitalist, and the People's Republic of China, they want a communist government, assuming, that if you polled all of the Chinese people, that was how that ended up, right? That they should have their own little spaces where they practice their own political programs. To some extent, that's fine because that's still a nation. And you would, I think, today be able to point and say, okay, well, Taiwan actually is a separate thing, for whatever it's worth, even though they might claim to be the government of China. It's really its thing over here, and they've got their own politics and their own political parties, and they have their own cultural zeitgeist. And if you went to Taiwan and spent an afternoon there, you would recognize, I'm in Taiwan. And if you spend an afternoon in Shanghai, Beijing, whatever, you're like, I'm in Beijing. You know what I mean? I'm in the People's Republic of China, and I can tell because of the propaganda on the wall and the TVs or whatever. You know what I mean? And that's something you can actually participate in. The question I would have is, do those splinter offsprings, shoots, whatever, do they actually participate in the same way with the culture? And I would say, from a sociological perspective, no, which is separate than, the theological point I made earlier, right? There's a different standard for separating from a divine institution than there is from separating from a human institution like country. But that's my appeal.
Cool. Well, hey, this has been fantastic. I hope that this has been helpful both for people who are in depth in this conversation to kind of get a new perspective on it, but also for people who, again, are a part of, are familiar with American Christianity, have been a part of American Christianity, but aren't familiar with this new conversation that's developing. I hope that this helps bring us all more into this conversation so we can talk with each other about it and about the ways in which we're responding to what, different generations are saying are the potential failures of the previous ones, maybe new ways forward. And then also, again, just the way that new technology has allowed these conversations to happen in new ways that have never been. I think even your story about how you kind of regret maybe some of the things you said online initially, but that's just another way the other generation is, instead of waiting until they fully form the theology to publish their book on it. Yeah. They are documenting their changing experience online. And whether or not you think it's a good or bad thing, that is just sort of the way that that's starting to happen. And there's, I think, a lot of good that can happen with that. So anyway, all to say is thank you so much for joining us. Is there's one more thing that you'd like to leave with people before we go, and where people can meet you and find, or maybe not meet you in person, I'm not going to put that out to the whole internet, but reach out to you and find you, whatever contacts or whatever content that you're putting, where can they go?
Yeah, so I have my YouTube channel, which is Young Anglican, and on that channel I post all kinds of things. I like talking as much about culture as I do about theology, but a lot of my videos focus on theology, and they don't just focus on the Episcopal versus ACNA question. They focus on all kinds of theology.
You're going to be talking about that for a little while, I think. So, yes.
Yes. Which is interesting on its own. I also have a email for inquirers, younganglican1@gmail.com. So some people are asking me questions. The thing I would also point people to is if they agree, they say, oh, is there actually anything in the Episcopal Church that's trying to make this positive change? Of course, there's the communion partners, but the organization that I'm the most close with that is actually fighting for orthodoxy is called the Episcopal Fellowship for Renewal. I think that's a great organization. They have a website. I think it's Episcopal Fellowship for Renewal.org or something like that.
Google it. It'll probably come up. Yes.
Yeah. So, I also think that the reverse mistake that a lot of conservatives have made in these institutions, especially older folks, would be to be conservative privately and kind of do nothing about it. I don't believe in that. I do believe we should actually fight for positive change in the denomination. Yeah.
be a hyper partisan within the structure that God has instituted. So to speak.
Exactly.
I would also recommend, again, for people who are interested in that and are more of the creative bent, like I am, Mockingbird, which is a New York-based organization that's very interested in orthodoxy, but also the arts is one that you might be very interested in. But yeah, thank you so much. Definitely, again, check out Young Anglican stuff and all the conversations happening on there. Very much appreciate you joining us today. This is Joseph Holmes. This is Religion Unplugged podcast, your one-stop shop for all the best religious news and culture.